Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en esta nueva sesión de nuestro seminario universitario de la cuestión social. Hoy pues tenemos el gusto y privilegio de recibir al profesor Bernard Chavans, quien está visitando nuestro país, impartiendo conferencias y participando en el lanzamiento de la edición en español de su libro La economía institucional, editado por el Fondo de Cultura Económica y que será presentado en la librería Octavio Paz mañana por la tarde por dos colegas nuestros. Se trata, pienso yo, de un trabajo muy útil y muy importante. Es en buena medida un auténtico tour de force de síntesis, pero al mismo tiempo de exposición de una, pues digámoslo así, de una vertiente de nuestro pensamiento, de nuestro conocimiento y de nuestra reflexión que hemos convenido en llamar la economía institucional. El libro tiene la gran virtud de ofrecernos de una manera muy accesible pues la diversidad de esta corriente de pensamiento, que en realidad son varias corrientes de pensamiento, de su historia y de sus implicaciones para nuestro propio conocimiento de la economía política del capitalismo. Bernard es doctor en Ciencias Económicas, es profesor emérito de la Universidad de París 7, París Diderot, investigador asociado y profesor en la Escuela de Estudios Superiores de Ciencias Sociales de París. Es miembro fundador de la Asociación Francesa de Economía Política y desde 1989 dirige la colección Países del Este en la editorial Lamatán, que ha publicado más de 50 libros. Trabaja sobre los grandes sistemas económicos, capitalismo, socialismo y su evolución histórica de largo plazo, sobre la economía de las instituciones y la historia del pensamiento económico. Bernard ha enseñado y sido conferenciante en varias universidades en Francia y en el extranjero, incluyendo Rusia, Japón, Kazajstán, China y en organizaciones internacionales como la UNCTAD. Tenemos la fortuna de que nos acompañe también Carlos Mallorquín Susarte, quien será como acostumbramos a hacerlo, el primer comentarista después de escuchar a Bernard Chavans, para luego dar la palabra a todos los que quieran usarla. Carlos es doctor en estudios latinoamericanos por esta Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, es investigador profesor en la Universidad Autónoma de Zacatecas, adscrito a la Unidad Académica en Estudios del Desarrollo y es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, autor de múltiples obras, dentro de las cuales se encuentran A Southern Perspective on Development Studies, Contributions from Latin America, El laberinto del desarrollo sustentable, y desde hace mucho tiempo un estudioso asiduo de lo que podemos llamar las ideas de la CEPAL, ¿no? De Furtado, Prebisch, etcétera. Pues vamos a darle la palabra a Bernard para luego escuchar el comentario de Carlos y luego lo que ustedes decidan hacer. Bernard, welcome again to the, in this case, to the postgraduate auditorium of the Faculty of Economics, and we're listening to you.
Okay. Thank you. So it's a great pleasure and a great honor to have the opportunity to speak here in UNAM and to make a short presentation of my book that has just come out about institutional economics. So I'll try to give a short, it's a short book, but I will give a short survey of the short book. So this is it. Now, in various social sciences in the last 2 or 3 decades, there was often discussion about the question of institutions. So some pointed to an institutional turn in various social sciences. This was observed in sociology, in politics, in history. Geography also was active. But our question today is the institutional turn in economics. This is a question that actually was not totally new, because it had been developed by a whole school of thought at the turn of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It was actually at that time an influential trend in economics thought. But this trend was marginalized, was somewhat forgotten for a long period, for I would say about 40 years, the period of highest influence of the neoclassical tradition, especially after the Second World War. But in the recent decades, starting I would say in the 1980s, 1990s, a new, very active school of thought that called itself New Institutional Economics was extended. But in parallel, the original tradition was also revived. So actually, this institutional turn in the recent period has 2 broad aspects: the original tradition that is being revived and extended on one hand, and the new institutional economics that has become very influential on a global scale. So in the book, I make a kind of a survey of the different ideas and theories about institutions, trying to show the present, to come to the present state and to show the different interactions or similarities and differences, but insisting on the high significance of this question of institutions for economics in general. So actually the story begins in the late, we could go further in the past, talking about the classical school. We could talk about Marx, whose view was a kind of institutional economics, but the real the strong tradition began in the late 19th, earlier 20th century, especially with the German historical school, which is known for its controversy with the Austrian school about the quarrel of methods. But these authors, especially Gustav von Schmoller, developed an original approach and insisted very much on the role of institutions for the analysis of the economy. So Schmoller gave this short definition that institutions are a set of habits and rules of morals, custom, and law, which are consistent and which form a system. So we have the 3 aspects of starting with custom, morals, and law. These different aspects have to be taken into account in any significant analysis of the economy. Examples of institutions are property, slavery, serfdom, marriage, the market, money, etc. So these institutions, according to him, give the framework of the economic action in society. He also introduced this concept of organs, very close to what we call today organizations. So organs are, for him, the personal side of institutions. So, for instance, marriage is an institution, but the family is the organ corresponding to the institution. So there are two sides of this question, organs and institutions. Types of organs he mentions are associations, corporations, communes, firms. The state can be seen as an organ. So this tradition was quite influential. Even Max Weber, in some way, was related to this tradition of the German historical school. Now, but the name of institutional economics became widespread through a number of significant American authors that actually had been influenced by the Germans, and this was developed especially in the first 30 years of the 20th century. So maybe the most famous founder of this tradition is Thorstein Veblen. He introduced the term of neoclassical economics as a critical term. Veblen was critical of the classical and of what he called the neoclassical school, the new classics, that he criticized essentially for their equilibrium and static view of economics, and for their teleological approach, that is a search of a final state of equilibrium to analyze any process in the economy. And also he criticized this tradition, especially through Alfred Marshall, for ignoring institutions. And according to Veblen, you cannot understand properly the economy if you don't take into account the essential role of institutions. And he was also promoting what he called an evolutionary view of institutions. That is, the question is change. So this is why the equilibrium concept is not adequate to understand change, according to Veblen. And for him, change is mainly understood through the Darwinian approach of evolution. For him, the theory of evolution with variation, inheritance, selection, these big concepts, they are not applied only to the biological sphere. They also have a significance in many fields of society, including the economy. So to understand change, you may try and make economics an evolutionary science. That was Veblen's perspective. So his definition of institutions was that they are habits of thought and action that are mainly inherited from the past. And he had a critical view of institutions. For him, they were quite conservative, inertial rules or habits of thought, which contrasted with the more dynamic aspect of technological change that was dynamic in the economy, while institutions were more conservative. So in this tension between technology and institutions, he saw a key of explaining many phenomena, including in modern capitalism. He also introduced this concept of process as a sequence of change taking place in time, as opposed to the equilibrium view that the neoclassical authors were developing already at that time. Now, I mentioned also in the book, I think, an interesting author, a disciple of Veblen, Walter Hamilton. He coined the term institutional economics that he proposed to describe these new views. That was 1918, and the term remained after that to describe economics centered on the question of institutions. So institutions are absolutely central in economy and history, but they are ambiguous. Their role is ambiguous, says Hamilton. So they are factors of order, but also they may be factors of disorder. They embody knowledge of previous generations or actors, but they also embody ignorance. So there is some ambivalence of institutions, which is essential. Now, the second great figure in the American tradition of institutional economics is John Roger Commons, a very important academic, but also legislator. He was working with the trade unions. He contributed much to the labor legislations, and many of his former students were very active in the New Deal in the 1930s. And his book, when he retired, he published the big book called Institutional Economics. That was the first time that a book was titled that way. 1934, actually. So institutions is linked to collective action, according to Commons. Collective action in restraint, in liberation, and in expansion of individual action. So it's the interaction between individual action and collective action that is the focus of institutions. So restraint, liberation, and expansion. So it's again an ambivalence of this concept because rules of institutions, they constrain actions. They restrain the possibilities of action. But by these restrictions, they allow to individuals they liberate in some way their action because they allow to anticipate the action of the others. And so eventually the individual action is expanded, especially through going concerns, through organizations, thanks to institutions. So his theory of institutions is focused on what he calls going concerns. He referred very much to new legal concepts from the American society and tradition, the new legal concepts that had been developed in the second half of the 19th century. So for him, he wrote a book also called The Legal Foundations of Capitalism. So it's a kind of reverse Marxian view because the legal system is seen as the basis of capitalism that would be a kind of superstructure. So legal foundations of capitalism. So going concerns, this new legal concept, for him it's absolutely central. That is organization, let's say. So organizations society is made of a great number of different organizations of different levels. And all these organizations, they are based on rules. So going concerns plus their rules, that is the definition of institutions according to Commons. He is also well known for for insisting on this concept of transactions. His point was that traditional economics on focusing only on exchange was very restrictive and one-sided. So he had a typology of the three types of transactions that are present in the economy, what he called bargaining transactions, close to exchange, but in even though the actors are at the same level, they are equals, let's say, in exchange. This does not impede that there may be different power in the exchange, even though it's a kind of horizontal relations. But there are other types of transactions, especially the managerial transaction, which is a vertical transaction between higher bodies and lower individuals. And a third type, which is different of these horizontal and vertical relations, what they call rationing transaction, where higher legitimate authorities, they distribute the benefits and the costs of different actions between the participants. So, and he believed that these three types of transactions gave a quite complete view of the complexity of situation in the changing economy. The formation of institutions, was the development of rules was based for him on the model of the common law, what he called the common law method. Actually, commons theory was very much based on the US case. He thought that in the American capitalism, there were institutional developments that allowed to build a very general theory of institutions. So he called the common law method the method by which a legitimate authority decides conflicts by introducing new rules. So this is not only what is seen in the law, in the common law tradition, the Anglo-American tradition, but for him, this is also the way rules change in any organization, be it a university, a firm, a trade union, etc. He also had this concept of futurity. That means that most economics has essentially discussed the influence of the past on the present. That was the classical school with the labor theory of value, or discussed the influence of present situation on present action. That was the neoclassical school with its theory of value, but there was another aspect extremely important. That's the influence of the future on the present, futurity. So individuals live in present institutions, but they have a representation of the future that influences their present action. This is very close, actually, to Keynes' view of anticipations. And Commons concluded that we have to include the insights of the classicals, past influences the present, neoclassicals, the present influences the present, but also we have to add this dimension, which is very important, of future on the present. So this is, you see, his views were quite original and I think very creative. He was a reformist. He was essentially searching for what he called a reasonable capitalism through the changes in rules in going concerns. So that's why he was very much concerned by the relation between law and economics. He continued in some way Schmoller by trying to combine law, morals, and economics. So economics was not seen as something separate from these other fields. Now, in the book, I also discuss the Austrian school, that is also an old tradition that is well known because it's a very radical economic liberalism that has been promoted by this school, but they also developed an original view of institutions, especially discussing with the German school tradition. So the founder of that school, Karl Menger, he said there are two types of institutions we must distinguish. There are those institutions that are made in a conscious and a deliberate way. He called them pragmatic institutions. But some other institutions, they are formed in a different way, that they are evolved institutions. They just are brought through spontaneous evolution. And the model for him was the money. Money, in his view, he has a special view of money. Money emerged because some individuals invented money, and the success they met in their action led other individuals to imitate them. And after time, this imitation process leads to institutions that have not been planned, that have not been designed in a conscious way, but that have been formed in a spontaneous way. And he called those institutions organic institutions. And many different institutions, for instance, language is an organic institution, but even law, according to Menger, and even the state were, like money, were organic institutions. For him, it was quite easy to explain pragmatic institutions. That's not difficult. That's not a problem. But organic institutions are much more difficult to understand. And then you need some explanation of invisible hand based on individual action, in methodological individualism. So that was the contribution of Menger to this approach. Now, the second name, very well known, 20th century, is Hayek, with a very important work extending from the 1920s to the 1980s. He's also well known for his developments of arguments for economic liberalism, his criticism of socialism, of Keynesianism, etc. But he continued the Menger tradition about institutions that he called orders. So there are two types of orders, according to Hayek. This continues the Menger argument. There are orders which are designed, which are constructed. They are organizations, organized orders. But other type of orders, like the market, like society in general, they are orders, but they have not been constructed consciously. They have not been designed. So he calls them spontaneous orders. And his criticism of socialism, Keynesianism, what it calls constructivism, he is based on this opposition. So if you look at the type of orders, the organizations are simple orders, which are constructed, while spontaneous orders are evolved, and they are complex orders. Organizations have a direction, but spontaneous orders have no direction. Both type of orders are based on rules, but the rules of organizations are finalized. They are linked to objectives, while the rules of a spontaneous order are not finalized. They have no objectives. They are applicable to any individual or organization. And so both types of orders are coordinated, but an organization is consciously coordinated by the direction. It may be planned in some way, but a spontaneous order, which is much more complex, which is a larger site, may not be planned. So it is coordinated by a kind of spontaneous process, which is actually the market. So this continues, again, the view of the invisible hand of Adam Smith. So the big critique of Hayek to the other traditions was that to socialism especially, was that they confused the two types of orders. They wanted to apply the rules of organized order to spontaneous orders. And this would lead, according to him, to a total dictatorship or totalitarianism. So this was his approach, and for him there was an evolution of a culture that was the evolution of institutions. Institutions were, at the beginning, were rules that were invented by a few individuals, and through imitation, just like the idea of Menger, other people may follow them, and the groups that have the institutions that lead to success will be imitated by other groups. And if the other groups do not imitate the successful ones, the successful rules, then they will decline, or they will be absorbed by the first ones. So in the end, the more beneficial institutions, the more, we could say, efficient institutions will survive. So this is, in this sense, there's a kind of a selection of good institutions, and he has the common law model also. He thinks that's the good model for a liberal economy, but with a very different interpretation than John Commons. So Hayek is very controversial, and many authors have criticized his too strong a position between organized and spontaneous orders, stressing that they are organized processes even in the market or in society, and there are spontaneous processes also in organizations. So it may be an interesting distinction, but if you radicalize it as Hayek, then you have questionable conclusions. His model of the British tradition as the only one which is today continued in some way in some neoliberal views, it has also been discussed. And his project to closely link economic liberalism with political liberalism has also been often questioned. But nevertheless, as we see, continuing Menger, he has quite a significant theory of institutions. So this is why in the book I classify the Austrian tradition as belonging to this very big family of institutional theories. Now we come to the more current situation with this trend called new institutional economics that I think we all know, that has been developed starting in the 1980s and mainly in 1990s. So it's quite a recent trend. Oliver Williamson was the man who coined the term new institutional economics, that stressing we have to reintroduce institutions in the economic theory, and he borrowed the concept of transaction from Commons, and this is why he used that term new institutional economics. In some way it's a paradox, because there is very little link or continuation from the first tradition of Veblen, Commons, etc., and the new institutional economics. So calling yourself new institutional economics would mean that you keep something of the first tradition, but actually this is not the case. And more than that, the new tradition, the new school had a strong contempt for the old ones, saying that it was descriptive descriptive approaches. It was not genuine theory. When economists don't like your theory, they just say, this is no theory. I make theory, but you have no theory, which is, of course, highly debatable. But the paradoxical thing is that at the beginning, new institutional economics takes this name, but does not follow the early tradition. And the second paradox is that gradually it will come closer to the questions, even some concepts of the original tradition. So that's one of the twists of the history of economic ideas. So Williamson, for him, there were two big institutions in capitalism. The market, that's the main one. Actually, you start from the market. And the second one is the firm, what he calls hierarchy. He borrows these ideas from Ronald Coase, but he keeps he is quite close of the neoclassical mainstream in the sense that he keeps an efficiency approach. So for him, the choice between market and the firm is an efficiency choice. So you just compare the transaction costs of two solutions and you economize on transaction costs. So as Williamson himself said, transaction costs theory, the first new institutional view, is more complementary to neoclassical tradition than something different. This will change with the other great figure, I think the greatest author in this new school, that's Douglas North. So he is an historian, so he doesn't start from the study of the firm like Williamson, but he has a wide historical approach. So he gave this very influential definition of institutions that they have mainly three dimensions. First, you have formal rules, rules that are codified, written, like laws, like institutions. Second, you have informal rules that quite often complement the formal rules. So informal rules are rules which are not written, not sanctioned by like law, for instance, conventions, norms of behavior. And the third aspect, quite important, is enforcement. The way the formal and informal rules are applied, are enforced. So when you speak of institutions, you always have to take these three dimensions into account. The way they are related, the way they change, the way they evolve, the way they are related in different national or historical contexts. So he also uses the image of rules of the games. Institutions are like rules of the games. Sports, this is not game theory. It's rules of the games in the sense of the sports, football. And the players are the organizations. So there are two levels. The organizations, they play in the given rules, in the institutions that come from the past, but they also play to change the rules in their interest. So there is a relation between organizations and institutions. North also, in the end, refuses the idea that we find in Williamson, for instance, that institutions are related to efficiency. He brings in the question of power. So institutions mainly result from the action of the holders of power. So this is interesting because it's an idea very close to the tradition of original economics. The question of power was central for the initial school. So in the 20th century, one of the influential original tradition economists was John Kenneth Galbraith. And as we know, his theory of the great firm, of the new industrial state, is based on power. He wrote actually also a very important book with this title, Power. So Douglas North, coming from an internal critique of neoclassical tradition, brings in this question of power, surprisingly without noticing that is coming closer to the original questions of the first tradition. So here we have a schematic model of his explanation of the sequence of change. So change in institutions begins in mental models, evolution in mental models, in ideologies. beliefs, then this results in new rules of the game. That's a new institutional framework, both for politics and for the economy. Then these institutions influence the incentive structure, what actions are incentivized. Then the structure of incentives influences the type of organization that will be created to act in the given framework of institutions. Then organizations will influence policies, and in the end, policies will influence what he calls performance. So here we have the notion of a new institutional economics, that in the end, institutions influence or even determine performance of national economies. We have to remember that when he speaks of performance, this refers to growth. So it's a very traditional or mainstream view of performance by reducing it to growth and without questioning this measure of growth. He has a long-term historical perspective in that respect. Now, an author which is following North but much closer to the mainstream, very influential today, is Acemoglu. And so he introduces this dualism of two types of institutions: extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. So inclusive institutions are the ones we see in, we could say, the most successful countries in history. For him, it's the Anglo-American tradition. So property rights, secure property rights, law and order, the state is acting to support markets, you have free entry in different sectors, so you have a level playing field in competition, and all these all these inclusive institutions are linked to, in some way or the other, to political democracy. So there is a strong relation between politics and the economy, according to Acemoglu. While extractive institutions are institutions devised in the interest of the elite, so in a predatory way to the people. So then inclusive institutions will give you good performance. Extractive institutions will give you long-term trajectories of low growth and divided societies. So this is a continuation of North, but twisting a bit in the direction of this distinction between good and bad institutions. That will be continued, and that we see in a moment in the recent period. I just mentioned in the book Elinor Ostrom, a very important author in my view. Her approach of the institutional diversity is very important. Her studies of the common pool resources, her comparative field studies in many countries of common pool resources, and she observed that the number of rules of institutions had been devised extremely diverse by communities, how to deal with common pool resources to avoid the exhaustion of these resources. So it's it's a refutation of the so-called tragedy of the commons. But she developed also a very sophisticated theory of institutions by linking political theory and economics, and also sociology, I would say. So, and she is very much against the idea that there are institutional solutions that could be applied anywhere. So proper institutions will be always developed in a given context. So they are not universal rules that you could recommend anyway. So there is no one-way solutions in institutional field. Now, the opposition between good and bad institutions has been taken up by international organizations in the recent period, and a number of also economic theories. So it's a kind of diversion, I would say, of the theory of North in a neoliberal sense. This has been very strongly developed in the last 20 years. So what the deemed good institutions are the institutions of the Anglo-Saxon tradition, or the way they are idealized in this approach. So economic freedom, secure private property, the rule of law, flexible labor market, deregulated finance, all these are the good institutions, while other interventionist institutions are problematic. They are not good institutions. So this notion of the quality of institutions was introduced, and a number of econometric studies have been made to try and relate good institutions to good performance. So we see how the neoliberal integration of these ideas have been made. Good institutions are measured in this approach through rankings, international rankings like the Freedom House ranking, the Transparency International, all the rankings about corruption made by businessmen, etc. So here you have a ranking of good supposed good institutions, and you make an econometric study to try and show that this brings good performance. Actually, this development is very controversial. There are many discussions about that, of all these works, especially the doing business reports of the World Bank. The World Bank has been very active in this perspective, and this has been criticized by a number of other institutional economists, saying that these supposed good institutions, they favor the rich over the poor, they favor capital over labor, etc. And the idea that good institutions would bring performance or development is questionable, because many historical experiences show that a process of development was the condition for improvement of institutions. So actually the relation between development and institutions is much more complex, and both ways compared to this new, let's say, neoliberal institutionalism. Now, I have to go quicker on the last part. I would just mention two current schools or groups or authors. On one hand, there is the French regulation school, which has been working in the last 30 years, which developed an original, rather macroeconomic and historical view of institutions about analyzing capitalism, by focusing on 5 institutional dimensions of various capitalist economies, and starting from there to compare them, to analyze what they call the diversity of capitalism, comparing in history and in the present time different types of capitalisms and their historic roots and the way they evolved through time. So it's a kind of comparative institutional approach that is quite close to some sociological theories of comparative capitalism. So in this view, institutions are mainly social compromises between different economic and social forces. So this is why economic institutions change mainly after big economic crises or social conflicts or wars. These are the times where new rules are devised, and they will give a new framework to economic processes. But this framework may be stable for some time, but it always contains internal tensions that sooner or later will lead to a new crisis in capitalist economies, and then new changes in institutions may develop. And this is the way they approach the economic history of capitalism. They also stress the fact that there is a complementarity of different institutions in a given national economy. So they are related. That's the notion of Schmoller, that the institutions make a system. They are interdependent. But also they speak of hierarchy of institutions. In different countries, different times, some institutions may be much more influential in the setup of institutions. So they give the example of the wage-labor nexus, the wage-labor relation that was central in the period of the high growth of Fordism after the Second World War. So wage-labor nexus relations, they were influencing the other aspects, the monetary regime, the role of the state, the competitive regime, etc. In the more recent period of capitalism, of financialized capitalism, this has changed, and the monetary and financial regime has become dominant. So, for instance, the wage-labor nexus now is much more dependent of this financial regime, which is a change in the hierarchy of different institutions. I will accelerate to reach the end. Another important author, very significant in the renewal of the original tradition of institutionalism, is Jeff Hodgson, a British economist, that defines institutions as established and embedded social rules that structure social interaction. A rule. What is a rule? A rule is a kind of injunction of the type: in circumstances X, do Y. So if you are in this situation, you should do this action. So this is the general framework of rules. And institutions for him are social embedded rules. Organization, here he discusses the Douglas North view that you should distinguish organizations as players and institutions as rules. For him, organizations are institutions. They are a subgroup of the variety of institutions. And he also discusses very much the question of relation between individual action and institutions. So you have theories that insist that any institution is based on individual action. So you should start from the individuals. But you also have the opposite view that individual action is determined by existing institutions. So you should start by the institutional level, the analysis. But of course, this is too dichotomous way of approaching the question. So it's a circular influence that goes from individual actions to institutions and back to individual actions. And this action has to be understood through time, because the temporality of the different levels of change are different. So this is one big question of institutional analysis. So I come to the conclusion. So we can say that institutional economics is a kind of a big family with many different approaches, but that share a number of theses. First, of course, institutions are important. Institutions matter. in economy, so you should not ignore them like in the neoclassical tradition. You should not leave them to other disciplines like sociology, politics, etc. Institutions influence, they are the basis of any economic systems, so systems are totalities of institutions, but and institutions influence economic development and growth. The neoclassical tradition is not adequate to understand institutions, especially not adequate to understand the process of change, which is central. A process view is opposed to an equilibrium approach. This is a common theme on different institutional theories. And very often these theories have tried to develop close relations with neighboring disciplines, especially history, but also sociology, politics. But however, there are many differences between these different schools, and sometimes very profound differences. There are even differences in the original school of institutional economics and important differences in the new institutional economics. So it's really, I use the image of the family. You know, you have many different individuals, they share a number of important things, but they may be extremely different, and this is the case. So some theories start from the individual. The methodological individualism is dominant, for instance, the Austrian school, while others would be more holistic approach, starting from the institutional level, like Veblen, for instance. Also, we have seen that the relation to a doctrine of economic liberalism is quite diverse, because some institutionalists are economic liberals. The Austrians, or maybe people like Acemoglu, would be closer to this tradition, while others, like I think of Commons or the heterodox current schools of Europe, they would be quite critical of economic liberalism. So even though they are all stressing the role of institutions, they have big divergences on this point. So some theories insist or focus on formal institutions, the law, for instance, while others, they focus on organic institutions, spontaneous institutions. So that's different way, even though they all think about institutions. Some theories are motivated by the critique of capitalism. Others, let's think of Hayek, for instance, are motivated by the critique of socialism. Also, different models to theorize institutions in general are mobilized by different theories. We have seen, for instance, the money taken as the general example for institutions by Menger. But on the other hand, we have Commons taking the case of the state and of the law as a general model to theorize all institutions. So it depends. It's not always the same, and this brings problem for a universal theory. If you want to have a very encompassing and general theory of institutions, you have to take into account the possible bias that comes from this. But I will conclude by saying that it remains, that's the conclusion of the book. It remains, I think, an adequate image to speak of the family of theories that share a number of important things that brought a renewal to economic thinking and that need to be continued, because both traditions actually have their own limits, of course, and they need to try and overcome these limits, and possibly the debate between the two traditions, which is extending, may contribute to that. But the conclusion is that this question of this centrality of institutions in economic history, in economic processes, is now well recognized, and we can hope that in the future there will be new developments and more debates about this question in economic thinking. Thank you.
Gracias, Bernard. Vamos a escuchar ahora a Carlos Marroquín.
Anyway, thanks. It was a wonderful, exquisite history of which really covers most of the ground of the book, and it's very difficult to point to specific elements which I might be able to touch, with which we can discuss the general outline of the book. Anyway, it's a wonderful synthesis. But given your exhaustive exposition, I want to emphasize a couple of points, or three points, which surround three issues of the argument. And that's because from the position I am, are the most important. Power, agents involved, and the notion of history, or the contingency of the elements, that is, the always changing nature of social life. But let me try to give you a basic example of how we can touch the aspects of institutions, or the antagonistic nature of our lives. I can ask you, why, when you take a taxi, why do you pay? I mean, if you're physically able, you don't pay and you run, right? Why do you pay? Think about it. Is there a state there guarding the taximan to charge you? Is there an organization by taximen to stop you from running? Or is there a series of habits, modes of thoughts, and institutions of which Bernard has spoken, that give you the option of election? So intrinsically, most social relations are constructed via this inherent decision-making by individuals. What I want to put emphasis on is that not all agents that take decisions are human beings. That is, many of the agents with which we deal and we organize our lives are entities which are not human beings. No? And so rules and working rules are sometimes really mechanisms by which agents are articulated, and not necessarily subjectively organized. So there's always a contingent, there's always a transitional element of decision of how subjectivities and the decisions are articulated with agencies that are not human beings, So there's a double heterogeneous and multiple movement in history. So that's the most important part of how institutionalism has tried to think the issue of how we solve our intrinsic antagonistic way of life. Or in a different sense, with a more Latin American flavor or vocabulary, what structuralists in Latin America in the 60s and 70s talked, the asymmetries of power. There's a systematic asymmetry of power in all our relations, even within the family. So there's a sense of how, in this wide variety of circumstances, we can have agents constituted despite the asymmetries of power. So another example of perhaps an institution, a price. Price is an institution. You know, you might be able to curb certain enterprises, certain firms, certain units of production, might be able to curb which is the margin of profit with which they can play. So within units of production, within firms, there's always also an antagonistic moment of how are we going to price next year? How are we going to balance our sheets? Then the most classic example of an institution is the rate of interest. Big debate. How do central banks establish a rate of interest? As you see, there's different levels by which institutions are constructed and made to survive a long history. It's interesting to notice that there's no guarantee then on the long run that those social relations, those specific asymmetric power relations will be solved positively for the agents in questions. So the agents, whether they are human beings or it's the Ministry of Justice or it's the Ministry of Economics, there's no guarantee that those decisions and those targets will be complied on. So the institutionalism poses questions to see how we can solve the issue of transforming social relations. From the Latin American vocabulary on these problems, which has been taken over by what's called neoclassical thought or neoliberalism, is that since the 50s and 60s, the main contention of how we think social lives is through structural reforms. Structural reforms within enterprises, between regions, between areas, and between individuals. Structural reforms meant creating new sets of rules and new sets of laws by which agents can face each other and counterpose powers. The other issue I wanted to put emphasis is that when we talk about agents then, which type of causality are we talking about? There's a long tradition in institutionalism whereby they use an architectonic or architecture metaphor or analogy. There's the famous base and superstructure in Marxism, which has been recovered a lot with institutionalism. That the causality, there's a downward or an upward causality, which Hodgson takes up a lot on his works, trying to understand how individuals can promote or can be the origin or the source of new laws, or how the state can impose certain causality and determination as to social relations. But I want to radicalize a bit this issue, and if we really take seriously the historical and contingent nature of social relations, its constitutive antagonistic sides, there's no necessary reason for arguing that we need an architecture or an architectonic type of metaphor to think power. I think today theories that have thought of those problems in terms of what is called emergent properties, that is, that the sum of the parts is not the totality in question, or that holism cannot be deduced from the parts, have tried to solve this issue with a specific type of causality determination. Totalities are constructed via individuals or via the top-down mechanism. In Latin America, structuralism has wavered that discussion in general, in the sense that the causality must be think, if you like, horizontally, not up or down, horizontally. Because always, if you place agents of all types, human, non-humans, you can call them workers' organizations, meet associations of taxi drivers to stop runaway payments, etc. We're talking about a contingent horizontal power relations that are changing systematically. And so recovering the contingent and antagonistic moments of what are the social relations are the best moments that institutionalism has produced, or are the best moments for the unknown today, young people that don't read Prebisch, don't read Furtado, Pinto, Sunkel, etc. But the interesting part of, and with this I'm going to finish, the interesting part about Latin American economic thought is that they've arrived to similar postures of new economics institutionalism from a different vocabulary. There's a radical interpretation, there's a radical confrontation of Eurocentric thought. That was important in Latin America. I mean, there's nothing personal, but the issue was always, how are we going to transform Eurocentric discourses to understand our own specific realities? And so there was, as it were, two routes theoretically, which are both politically inclined. One is that we have to transform the vocabulary that is imported. Even ideologies were imported, you know. And on the other hand, reconstruct those categories. And that's theoretical step of building bridges with past vocabularies is what must be seen here as a radical interpretation of discourses. And also strictly to think local and contingent elements. Because institutional economics has offered the possibility that we cannot have a general theory of how we should organize ourselves or how we should establish the top-down dichotomy developed by them. In Latin American economic theory is not a general theory about a totality, because it has no concept of a totality. A different way of saying this is that Latin American thought has no theory of a system, because it doesn't believe that agents can be posed as parts of a system, in the sense that the contingent and antagonistic moments of agents make it very difficult to think in the system parts type of argument. So I think this is the best way to counterpose institutionalism. I think if there's a critique towards institutionalism, is the notion that you can really think in terms of a constitutive totality or a constitutive systemic system by its own parts, which then opens ground to how do we struggle to change society? How do we reform? How do we construct new institutions? And well, that's it's a crucial issue. Mexico has just changed age-old regime. And it's an area where we must all engage and think about how we're going to reform this new era that I hope it's positive for Mexico. Thank you.
Pues está abierta la lista. ¿No? ¿Todo quedó claro? Sí. Jaime Ross.
Yes, just a doubt and a question on the relationship between institutional economics, all these large group of currents and schools, and neoclassical economics. Because it seems to me that the critique from institutional economics that neoclassical economics ignores institutions may not be perhaps the best way of putting the relationship between institutions and neoclassical economics. I would tend to think rather that neoclassical economics assumes a particular set of institutions that, including the protection of property rights, guaranteeing exchange, etc., that work in a way perfectly well. And institutional economics discusses how these institutions may have emerged, for example, in the Austrian school, or what happens if these institutions depart from the perfection assumed by neoclassical economics. So that's my comment or question, or
yes,
for your observations on the matter.
okay.
Should we
Take
some
differently,
of-
yes, yes.
¿Algo más? Sí, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for the book. Sometimes it's said that Mexico needs different institutions, that we have to have like Swedish institutions. And some of us say that we have to first grow to the level of the GDP of Sweden in order to have Swedish institutions. What goes first? Institutional reform or economic development as such?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand
I'll do it
properly.
again. Sometimes it's said that Mexico needs different institutions,
Yes.
that we have backward institutions in Mexico, the rule of law, you name it. And perhaps the different perspective is that first we have to have the level of GDP of Sweden in order to have Swedish institutions. What goes first, economic growth or institutional reform?
Okay. Yeah. Thank
Or
you.
in Swedish if you want.
Sí, Mario Luis.
One of the things that is inside of this historical review of how we have thought of institutions is the definition of the role of the state. In this century, there is, I think, a new discussion in terms of what's the role of the state, which tends to be neoliberal in terms of macroeconomics, but it's, in some way, my hypothesis is it is resigning to the liberal toleration of difference and all the school of thought that we believe that democracy and markets were embedded in a state which was tolerant to all the difference and all these different ways of living life. So in this century, with this change of the role of the state, especially we have this reference on the United States, was what we are thinking, is how are institutions going to be affected of this change of role in terms of a state which doesn't defend difference?
Sí. Sí, Sara.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to ask you how the institutionalism nowadays can help us address the topic of power, because it seems to be a topic that is absent from economic thought, at least in the most orthodox way. And for example, this morning we had a conference with Professor Robert Blecker, and the lecture was about wage-led growth or profit-led growth. And he said that the two choices were possible theoretically, but I mean, in practice, it depends of the characteristics of a certain economy and also about the conflicting interest of the two groups, workers in the one side and firms in the other side. And part of the question is what country do we want? One that is mainly led by profits, or if we want to have a big portion of the GDP taken by workers. So how power can be rethink now from the institutional view? Thank you.
Okay.
It was an excellent review about the history of institutions. My question is about what's the role of democracy in, it's not mentioned too many about the historic review. And how, I'm aware of that economists seems to get anxious when we can't measure something. And all the econometric exercise about measuring the performance of institutions, well, are maybe it's just a guide to know if institutions are working or not. But in your opinion, how can we determine if institutions in some country works or not? And for example, Professor Moreno Reed talked about Swedish institutions and about the PIP. But I am thinking about Asian institutions that are very authoritarian and have and some of their economies have good levels of GDP. So how can we determine that institutions works, maybe not following the neoclassical exercises to try to measure them, and the role of democracy in developing better or worse institutions?
Okay. Okay. Thank you. There was a final question.
Okay, thank you so much. A very quick question. There is a similar tension. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the comments. There is a very similar tension in the discussion between old and new institutionalism and old and new extraterritorialism. So my question is, this kind of renewing, we can see it as a deviation from the radicality of the previous argument, and we can see it as a way of try to be more present in the public discussion and in the policy making field. So how can we treat this? Is a deviation from the radical argument from the previous school, or it's a way of being more influenced?
Okay. So about the question, the first question about neoclassical theory, not ignoring institutions, but actually taken institutions as given. I think this is quite right. The institutions are considered as being given and possibly efficient, and this is why you don't have to include them in the field of economics proper. But they are not totally ignored. They are implicit, they are there. This is why it's legitimate that other disciplines would treat about institutions, but economics is dealing with rational action, dealing with the market in a given institutional context. When neoclassical economists started to think about institutions as early as the 1960s, they began to think about efficiency. They started from the neoclassical concept of efficiency. For instance, Douglas North himself, at the beginning, his first view of institutions was that they were efficient solutions to economic problems. And it's only gradually that his institutional approach took a bigger distance with neoclassical economics. So actually, the relations are more complex than the simplified view I gave. But as a simplification, we could say that for the main part of the 20th century, the neoclassical tradition has left institution aside. And it's only through renewal of the first tradition of institutional economics or the development of new institutional economics that the question has been reincorporated at the center of economic thought. Now, the question about the Swedish level and of GDP and the Swedish institutions. That's the question I just mentioned about the discussion of Acemoglu, or the debate on institutions and development. So the very frequent thesis we find in new institutional economics is that good institutions or proper institutions like correct property rights, etc., will bring growth, performance, development. And so the criticism, very often linked to original institutional economics, stresses that this is very one-sided, because the many countries that today are considered having succeeded, the most highly developed, the US, the Sweden, etc., they did not reach this level with the proper institutions. For a long time, it was a historical process through which development with different types of institutions led to a transformation, to improved institution setup. So this is also linked to the question of efficiency. So the French regulation school insists on that. They stress that the notion of performance is quite questionable, and usually the measure of performance limited to growth is highly debatable. The most important question is what they call the viability of an institutional setup. And this might be institutions that are deemed not good in the neoliberal perspective, but many of them have led to processes of growth and development in history. And I didn't mention it, but today we have the main counter-example to the neoliberal theories of institutions. It's China. Because if we take the mainstream view of performance, growth, this is an absolutely exceptional and unique case, actually, in history. For 40 years of very continuous high growth. But now, if you take the Chinese institutions, the change of institutions, they are all extremely far or contrary to what is deemed the good institutions. So this is a frequent criticism that has been made, for instance, to Acemoglu. See, if they have extractive institutions, according to you, but they have very good performance. So there is a problem in your determination. So his answer is yes, but maybe they have had this good performance, but this is only transitory. There were specific conditions. They had a big reserve of labor, which could go to the industry, to cities, but sooner or later this will collapse, and if they don't shift to the good institutions, it will not last in the long term. But this is very questionable, because you have to explain the 40 years. 40 years is enormous in economic history for a high growth process. So this is why this, let's say, moral values used to discuss institutions are quite questionable, I think. We have seen many historical processes with a diversity of existing institutions that have led to processes of growth, development, or non-growth, non-development. So this diversity has to be understood in a contextual perspective, as you mentioned. This is why history is so important. The notion that everything would move to a more efficient solution or organization is deeply questioned by history, and I think institutional economics stresses the questionable character of this view. Now, the question of tolerance, the role of the state, and how the decline in tolerance may transform a number of economic and social relations. Yes, I think this is a very, very important. But tolerance, the forms of tolerance, the degrees of tolerance, are themselves rules and institutions. Which are generally informal, to take the North definition, but they may be also take formal forms, through changes in laws, etc. So it is true that the state influences much more the formal aspect of tolerance, of differences which are so important for social life, but also for the economic life. But it's always linked to this question of informal rules. So, and the answer, there is no general answer. I think it's always in a historical context that you can understand how the evolution of the legislation of the state, for instance, will have social consequences in terms of tolerance of differences. I think institutional views are very sensitive to the question of difference in general in the economy. They, as opposed as to the neoclassical tradition of viewing one single form as more efficient, and that other types should converge to the more efficient form. So the idea of difference is much more stressed in other theories. Even theories like Schumpeter theory of capitalism stresses the importance of differences. And institutional economics, I think, is focused on what I call differential changes, the difference of temporalities of change at the individual level, the level of organizations, the level of institutions, the level of the whole system. All these levels are taken in processes of change, but the temporality of changes are different. And this is one of the main questions of institutional analysis. The problem of power. Power is absent from economic thought. It's absent from the, let's say, mainstream tradition that focuses on exchange, on contract. But as I tried to show in the presentation, the question of power is central for institutional approaches of economics. Even the new institutional economics of North insists on the importance of power. So, and you mentioned the difference between let's say the post-Keynesian approach between the different types of growth, wage-led or profit-led growth. Actually, the Keynesian tradition has had some interactions with the institutional tradition. This is very obvious in the theory of Kaldor, for instance. The notion of circular and cumulative causation that you find in Kaldor, or also in Merdel, is typically Veblennian. Even Keynes himself. In Keynes, Keynes actually had some relation with commons. And recently there was discovered a letter of Keynes to Commons. Commons had sent the draft book of institutional economics to Keynes, 1927 maybe. And Keynes wrote a letter saying to Commons, there is no other economist in the world today that I feel closer than you. That's amusing because Keynes was not... usually was not making this kind of compliments publicly. Actually, it was a private letter. But it's interesting because actually in Keynes also we have taking into account the institutions, especially what the separation of ownership and control, the new role of trade unions. All these institutional questions are important in Keynes' view and his opposition to the mainstream tradition of the time. So even today, we find in the post-Keynesian tradition an institutional dimension, which is lateral, let's say, but which is present. So, and it refers to the question of power. So the problem of distribution, of course, and the central distribution between wage and profit is related to power. But power is mediated by rules, which may be social compromises, and this is the basis of what the French school of regulation would call the accumulation regime. So this is an example in macroeconomics where the institutional dimension intervenes. The question of democracy. Yes, it's a big problem, but there are different views, of course, in institutional economics. That's the problem of values. You know what, and institutional tradition, especially the original one, has insisted on this question of values in economics. So, and there are many values that may be conflictual. Also, the sociological tradition has thought a lot about that. So, for instance, the value of democracy or the value of efficiency or growth. There is an author, János Kornai, the Hungarian economist, that has contributed on this question. Actually, it generally follows the classical separation between positive analysis and normative analysis of the values. But his point is that you should state the values that you have before you start the analysis. You should not think that it's possible to separate completely the normative and the positive approach. So being in favor of democracy is a value position. What it implies for institutional change will be understood differently by different authors. But you may have institutional theories that do not take democracy as a value. For instance, Schmoller was rather in favor of the authoritarian state, of the Prussian state. He was fighting socialism also. So while others, like for instance Commons, was very much in favor of democracy, but these different views do not are related in different ways in the approach of institutions. Now, so has the radicality of let's say old or original institutional economy. I do not use so much the term old as opposed to new, because as we know, this is a value also. You know, what's new is good and what's old is outdated. So this is why I use this term of original tradition, but actually it's old in the historical sense. Was it more radical than the more current theories, especially the heterodox theories that I mentioned? I'm not sure. There are various degrees of radicality, especially in the critique of capitalism. Veblen was a radical critique of capitalism and of capitalist institutions. But Commons, the other great name in this tradition, as I said, he was not in favor of destroying capitalism. He was in favor of reforming it. He was looking for a reasonable capitalism. So even at that time, the degree of radicality was different. And today, even in heterodox theories of institutionalism, you will find different degrees of radicality. And there is not such a strong link between doctrinal position and the theory proper. This is why in the conclusion of the book, I think there are a number of overlap and complementarities between all these different views or theories, even though they don't adopt the same doctrinal position. So we should sometime make a difference between doctrinal stand and the theory proper. This is also true for our discussions about neoclassical economics, because very often there is an identification between neoclassical and neoliberal, and I think this is a mistake, because the neoclassical theory is not necessarily linked to economic liberalism. Actually, for a long period, it has been linked to a form of Keynesianism, which is not economic liberalism. So this relation between economic theory and economic doctrine is quite complex, varies with time. This is what my book is mainly centered on economic theories. And there is no direct relation, I will say. Okay.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
I just want to take up an issue here, which I think is important. One has to do with the issue of democracy. And with the issue of democracy, I want to differentiate precisely what was mentioned here about old and new structuralism. Old structuralism has specific and clear decision. Whether you like it or not, we need to transform society. The 50s and the 60s of the last century, past century, it was basically a theory which propounded vis-a-vis Marxism modes and methods to change society. Most structuralisms of all ideological forms, from Pinto, that was communist defender, from Urquidi, which was an extreme liberal, a Mexican economist, from Prebisch, that was a very pragmatic leader. Most of the old school had already made a political clear decision. Societies had to be changed. And so we had to have mechanisms, a categorical analysis of how to change societies. They had made a decision, a democratic political decision, to change society. That's the way they take up change. Yeah? And so the debate in the 60s and 70s in Latin America are with two different types of how we want change. There's an old school, whether we're in accord or not, of Marxism that criticize old structuralism, because they believe that the methods of change in society had to be done by a different method. But old structuralists had already taken the decision to adopt and change societies, because it thought the nation in construction as a term to include all the various nationalities of each country, which brings me to the question of China. I mean, our account identities talk about a vast rate of growth of China, but China has no unity. It's a heterogeneous entity with colonialism within different areas, which González Casanova touched on in Mexico. Nations are not a unified form of being to examine, and that's what's so important about structuralism, because with the notion of heterogeneity and center periphery or core and periphery, you can calculate changes in societies. So, just to finish up, I really believe that the worst place to be poor in the world is China. To be poor in China, really, you have no hope. I mean, there's 300 million people that are living off the sweat of 800 million people. So really, the worst place to be today in the fastest growing so-called country, which I'm questioning, is China. This is the worst place to be poor. There's no mechanism by which you can distribute technical progress like it was argued in Latin America. Thank you.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a Bernard Chamans y a Carlos Marroquín por su muy interesante conversación y sus muchas sugerencias y provocaciones para continuar con nuestra tarea normal de pensar la cuestión social y al mismo tiempo imaginar y discutir las políticas y estrategias que podrían servir para superar la cuestión social mexicana tal y como la hemos descrito a lo largo de estos ya largos años. Como lo dijo Bernard, el tema de la economía institucional nos remite a la variedad, a la diversidad, y yo diría que nos obliga también a asumir el tema, para mi gusto no resuelto, de lo que se llama comúnmente en la literatura las variedades del capitalismo. En efecto, encontramos muchas variedades de la organización capitalista, pero luego topamos con el hecho de que hoy, por ejemplo, pues prácticamente todos los capitalismos están sujetos a la consolidación fiscal, llamada austeridad en nuestras llanuras, ¿no? Y entonces el tema de las variedades del capitalismo choca con una realidad tosca, que nos llevaría a repensar el tema de las instituciones y su posible diversidad. Pero en fin, es un tema como otro. Está claro, ya lo hemos dicho en las últimas sesiones, que tendremos que acercarnos a lo que está preocupando a muchos estudiosos, Bernard entre otros, y que tiene que ver con el capitalismo, con su composición actual, su capacidad para recomponerse, pero al mismo tiempo su incapacidad para dominar las tendencias más oscuras, a un crecimiento lento de largo plazo, a a una agudización de la desigualdad, ya no en el lado oscuro del planeta, o sea, nosotros, sino en el lado brillante del mismo, o sea, los Estados Unidos y Europa, ¿no? Entonces, probablemente, digo, estoy pensando en voz alta, para mis colegas del SUX, probablemente tengamos que acercarnos a una agenda que no sea la única, para no abandonar nuestros quehaceres conocidos, pero una agenda que podría ser ocasional pero permanente, para abordar estas grandes temáticas y problemáticas, ¿no?, que se están enfrentando en otros lados. Comentaba yo con Bernardo hoy en la mañana, bueno, en Estados Unidos se preguntan dos profesores connotados de Harvard sobre la muerte de la democracia, o la señora Albright nos advierte sobre el fascismo, u otro demócrata progresista muy conocido en los Estados Unidos se pregunta si la democracia va a sobrevivir al capitalismo y a la globalización, o en Alemania el profesor Streeck se pregunta por el fin del capitalismo y cómo va a ser este. Bueno, yo creo que debíamos hacer un esfuerzo porque esas preguntas no nos queden muy lejos e incorporarlas a nuestra agenda de discusión y reflexión. Por lo pronto les informo que el miércoles entrante, a lo largo del día, habrá en este mismo auditorio una discusión sobre el último informe, o el más reciente informe, presentado por la Comisión Económica para América Latina a los países miembros, que tiene como tema principal la ineficiencia de la desigualdad. Empezaremos, bueno, con una presentación del documento por parte de la secretaria general de la comisión, la maestra Alicia Bárcena, y a lo largo del día habrá diferentes discusiones de los apartados que forman el informe. Están convocados e invitados. Del 25 al 27 de septiembre tendremos nuestro 11º Diálogo Nacional por un México Social, que subtitulamos A 10 años de la Gran Recesión. Lo haremos en el Auditorio Ho Chi Minh de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM por 3 días. Verán ustedes próximamente el programa detallado, ¿no?, de nuestras actividades. Pues por lo pronto, muchas gracias, Bernard. Thank you very much. Merci.
Merci.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Y gracias a ustedes.
Nos vemos, suerte, que vaya bien.
Carlos, gracias. Hasta luego.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay, thanks.
No, ya lo saben, ¿no? Bueno, les informo que el libro de Bernard está aquí a la venta, a la salida del auditorio. What is it?
It's okay, I was taking my key. Yes, yes.
Okay, fine. Well, for now,
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the rest, how many days I must stay here?
Another 10 days.
Good.
Yes.
So you'll have a chance to
Yes, yes.
more or less see the city.
Yes, yes.
We'll see
Yes.
each other tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Es que mandamos el mensaje y no hace que se nos vaya viendo. Yo creo que mañana ¿quién está?
Entonces le digo a Elena que lleve las dos presentaciones.
Porque venía una parte, pero otra parte.
Sí, vi que estaba Navarrete.
Navarrete.